Hello, and welcome to Magic Concepts, a series where we explore Magic the Gathering concepts starting from absolutely zero knowledge about the game and going all the way through Pro Tour level strategies. Today, of course, we're starting on Part 1, the basics of gameplay. So, getting into what is Magic the Gathering. First of all, it is a collectible card game in which you take on the role of a planeswalker, a powerful mage able to step in between the planes of this universe and into others throughout what is known as the multiverse. Mana is the force of life and the source of all magic within the multiverse. Mana is used in the casting of nearly every spell in Magic the Gathering and comes in 5 different colors, each with its own flavor and variety. Starting off with white mana. Plains are going to be your primary source of white mana within Magic the Gathering. This is the color of healing and justice and holiness, and has the ability to utilize a lot of small creatures very quickly. To put this in real world terms, you would expect doctors, soldiers, priests, and clerics to be very closely tied to white mana. Islands are going to be the primary source of blue mana. Blue is the color of the mind, of the sea, and of the sky. Blue mages have the ability to create illusions and to stop opponents from even casting spells at all. In real-world terms, you would expect scientists to be especially tied to blue mana, along with birds and creatures of the sea. Swamps are going to be your primary source of black mana. Now, black is the color of power at all costs, even if it means your death or the death of those around you. In real-world terms, morticians are very closely tied to death and would make excellent use of black mana. You would also see that in politicians going after power and corporate executives making the most use of that black mana to secure their power. Mountains are going to be your primary source of red mana. Red is the color of passion and creativity, and these fires are very easily expressed in the real world by artists and performers. Forests are going to be your primary source of green mana. Green is the color of nature and growth. For example, farmers would harness green mana to grow food, while forest rangers would use that to protect the wildlife under their care. Also in fantasy settings, you'll see elves living amongst nature, making abundant use of green mana. So once we have all of this mana, what do we do with it? In the Magic the Gathering, there are different cards and spells that you can cast. These include instants and sorceries, creatures, enchantments, artifacts, and you can even summon other planeswalkers to assist you in combat. As a card game, each card in this game has different parts, which tell you different things about the card. First of all, each card has a unique name. It also has a very specific casting cost. Up in the top right-hand corner, this is the amount and type of mana that you need to cast a spell. This spell in particular, the Skyfisher Spider, will require 1 green, 1 black, plus 2 additional mana of any color or colorless in order to cast. Each card has an identifying image, and in the middle section it has the card type, along with the set and rarity symbol. Below that we have the rules text for the card, and the number 1 rule in Magic. After we go through all of the turn orders and all of these are what the cards do, the number 1 rule is that the card is king. No matter what the other rules say, if the rules text in a card says something different, then that is what happens. The card supersedes any standard base rules. If a card is a creature there on that type D line, In the bottom right-hand corner, it will have a power and toughness. The power is how much damage that creature can deal during combat. The toughness is how much damage that creature can take before it dies. Also, each card in the bottom left corner will have set information and collector numbers. And much like the set rarity symbol in the middle right, it will tell you what set this card is from, what the rarity is of this card, and other collector information, like who the artist was for the image. We normally think of wizards and mages as casting spells. In Magic, that takes the form of instants and sorceries. So, for example, an instant is a very quick effect. It can be cast at virtually any time, even on your opponent's turn. Instants versus sorceries do have some trade-offs, which we'll go over here. Instants will generally have a higher mana cost than a sorcery with the same effect. As we see, this Go for the Throat requires 2 mana. It requires 1 black plus 1 more of any other type. And it is an instant, so you can destroy a non-artifact creature on your turn, on your opponent's turn, in the middle of combat, whenever it would be most advantageous to you to destroy that creature. In contrast, a sorcery like Annihilating Glare is a little bit slower. It can only be cast on your turn and only during your main phase, and we will cover those here in a little bit. But alternately, it is generally cheaper. A sorcery of the same effect, such as this one that lets you destroy a creature, only costs 1 black as a sorcery instead of 2. Plus, as a sorcery, it will generally have a greater effect. This one can destroy any creature, not just a non-artifact creature. In addition, it can destroy an ally planeswalker. But slinging spells isn't the only thing you can do in Magic the Gathering. You can also use your mana to summon creatures. For example, you can use 1 green plus 1 other mana to summon this Cankerbloom. It is a creature that will stay on the battlefield on your side, and that's what we call a permanent. A permanent is any card that will remain in play from turn to turn, versus an instant or a sorcery that you'll cast, it will have its effect, and then it will leave play. These creatures can attack your opponents, and if your opponent is attacking you, they can actually block your opponent's attacks. And many creatures will have special abilities, and we'll go over how those different abilities affect the game here in a bit. Enchantments are another type of permanent. An enchantment you will cast, and it will go on the battlefield, and it will have its effect, and that will remain in play until the enchantment is removed, just like a creature. Enchantments are generally harder to kill or remove from the game than a creature. As a creature can be destroyed through combat, enchantments generally do not attack or block. However, an enchantment can be placed upon a creature, such as this one here, Audacity will enchant a creature, and then it will augment that creature. It will gain power, it will gain abilities, and it will make that creature stronger. Alternately, there are enchantments that will hinder creatures, and those you can cast upon your opponent's creatures to make those creatures unable to block or unable to use their abilities, or a variety of different effects. And some of the stronger enchantments that remain in play can even alter game rules by providing you different conditions of victory. Artifacts are another type of permanent. They are generally colorless and can be added into any deck. The effect of the artifact can serve to function in ways that your color normally would not be able to. In addition, an artifact can function as legitimately any part of the deck. It can act as an enchantment and just stay on the field. It can be equipped to a different creature to augment its abilities like an enchantment would. It can even mimic a creature like this Doom Mover here. And the abilities that it has can help shore up different areas of your deck that might need help. And our last permanent type is going to be a Planeswalker. These powerful cards function just as another player. as if your friend came up to the table, sat down beside you, and is helping you win your match. Now, a Planeswalker will have a loyalty counter, as we see Tyvar's here in the bottom right starts at 3 loyalty, and he will use that as effectively his life total. A Planeswalker will have abilities that they use, as opposed to the cards that you draw to be part of your hand. So while you would cast spells via mana, he uses his loyalty to activate his abilities. And a Planeswalker can be attacked directly by creatures and targeted by spells, as we saw earlier. So we've been talking about different abilities that cards possess. And there are 3 basic types of abilities. The first one is a triggered ability. This happens automatically whenever the trigger happens. So, for example, Undead Butler has the triggered ability that whenever it enters the battlefield, you would mill 3 cards. This happens immediately upon the creature entering the battlefield, just as if it were an instant spell. Likewise, when it dies, it has another triggered ability that lets you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Once again, this happens immediately upon the creature dying. The second type of ability is an activated ability. These, once again, are generally going to be at instant speed unless the card says otherwise, and they can have a variety of effects, from the Cankerbloom we saw earlier destroying an enchantment or artifact, to the Hunter's Maze, where you can sacrifice it to draw cards. In addition, these activated abilities are not cast, and so they are very hard to counter through means like counter spells that blue has access to. The third type of ability is a static ability. These types of abilities are always in effect, and they are almost impossible to suppress. So for example, we see the Consuming Blob has the ability that its power and toughness is equal to the number of card types in your graveyard. So if you have a creature, an artifact, and a land in your graveyard, then he is going to be a 3 power, 4 toughness creature. If you then cast an instant or a sorcery, he grows in power as those cards are cast. And so these static effects are just always in effect and always update with the board around them and alter gameplay in that effect. And since this is a game and you take turns with your opponent, it does have an order that the turn progresses in. At the beginning of your phase, you will untap all of your permanents, and we'll see this happen in the sample gameplay coming up. You will proceed to your upkeep, where any upkeep triggers happen, instants can be cast. If nothing happens there, you'll proceed to your draw step, and then you'll enter your main phase. This is where you can play your lands for the turn and cast your spells before combat. Once you have finished your pre-combat main phase, you proceed to combat. Combat has its own steps, where you can declare your attackers, your opponent declares their defenders, and then you proceed to damage resolution. Then after combat, there is a second main phase, where if you have not yet played your lands for the turn, you can do so, or if you have other spells that you can cast if you have mana available, you can do that after combat as well. And then you proceed to your end step. During your end step, any effects that say until end of turn will end, and any damage on creatures will be healed. The turn then proceeds to your opponent, who starts with their untap step, proceeds to their upkeep, and so forth, and you continue taking turns until one player is reduced from 20 life down to 0, or other win conditions are met. To begin a game of Magic, each player shuffles up a deck of 60 cards. This deck cannot contain any more than 4 of each individually named card other than basic lands. We're using forests and swamps, for example. Each player starts off at 20 life, and the first player is determined at random by rolling dice, flipping a coin, or some other method of random selection. Each player then draws their starting hand of 7 cards and determines if they want to keep those cards. If a player determines that their starting hand will not give them a decent chance at winning, they are allowed to mulligan those cards by shuffling them back into their deck and drawing a new set of 7 cards. Once they have been dealt a hand that they are happy with keeping, then each player will put a number of cards from their hand onto the bottom of their deck, equal to the number of mulligans they took. So in our case, we didn't mulligan at all, so we start with a full 7 cards. If you were to mulligan once, you would put 1 card back and start with 6, and so on. But the first couple turns in Magic are usually pretty boring, consisting of each player putting their land on the battlefield for the turn, casting their first permanents if possible, and then passing the turn. So we're now on turn 2, and we have enough lands to cast our first spell, Dune Mover. Now, this card has an ability that when it enters play, we can search for a land from our deck, which we really need in order to cast the rest of our spells. So we'll tap our 2 lands for mana and play Dune Mover. Our opponent in this match has an instant spell that he can cast in response to our summon spell. So he taps his 2 lands and casts the spell Make Disappear. This is called a counterspell. By the rules text on this card, unless I pay 2 additional mana, my Dune Mover will be cancelled and will go straight to the graveyard with no effect. I don't have any additional mana, which is why I needed to cast Dune Mover in the first place, so my spell is countered. With nothing else to do, my turn ends and my opponent's turn begins. We see that his lands untap at the beginning of his turn. This is called the untap step. There's nothing to do during his upkeep, so he proceeds to draw his card for the turn, play his land during his main phase, and then pass the turn back to me. On my turn, my lands untap as well during my untap step, so that I can now use them again for this next turn. With nothing to do during my upkeep, I proceed to draw my card for the turn, which happens to be another copy of Dune Mover. As I tap my lands for mana, you can see them entering my mana pool. And as I try to cast my second Dune Mover, it again gets countered by my opponent. The opponent untaps, draws his card for the turn, and casts Maestro's Charm to get an additional card. Even though this is an instant spell that could be cast at any point, even on my turn, he is choosing to play it during his main phase, most likely to find another counter spell or some other form of removal, since he appears to be playing a control deck. And we'll talk about more about what a control deck is in later videos. So since our opponent is now tapped out from casting his last spell, meaning that he has no more lands to tap in order to counter my spells, now is a good time for me to resolve a creature and get a presence on the battlefield. Casting my Undead Servant will mill me 3 cards, which will put a land and a sorcery into my graveyard, which will grow my Consuming Blob once I finally get enough mana to cast it. Now, not wanting to kill my creature, because when it dies I can get my Dune Mover back, the opponent instead casts his 3 damage straight at me, taking my life total down from 20 to 17. Now, if my life falls all the way down to 0, I will die and my opponent will win the match. On my turn, I will choose not to do anything during my first main phase, instead going directly to combat. I declare my Undead Butler as an attacker, and my opponent has no blockers to declare, so I will proceed straight to dealing damage. My creature has a power of 1, so I will deal 1 damage to my opponent's life total. Now, after combat, I proceed on to my second main phase, where I cast my second creature, Anchor Bloom. Now, if my opponent had not cast his spell during his main phase, he could have cast it during my turn, either by killing my creature before it attacked him, killing my new creature as I summoned it, or damaging me directly the same as he did originally. But it looks like my opponent has another plan, casting a sorcery on his main phase, Hostile Takeover. Now, this spell will unfortunately kill all of my creatures, wiping my board clean. But the Undead Butler does have a triggered ability whenever it dies, so I can now get back my Dune Mover. So on my turn, all of my permanents untap, and I draw my card for the turn. The opponent is tapped out again, so I can freely cast anything in my hand, except for my blob, because I don't have enough mana for him yet. So I could cast my 4-mana Spider to have a 3-power creature on the field, but I would rather cast my Dune Mover and pull another land out of my deck so that I can eventually cast my Blob, which is going to be the finisher on my deck. With nothing else to do, I pass back to my opponent, who just kills my creature anyway by reducing his toughness to 0. On my turn, I finally have enough mana to cast Consuming Blob. But my opponent has shown that they're able to counter my spells and kill creatures directly, and has the mana up to do so. So I want to wait until I have enough mana open to protect my Blob with Tyvar's Stand. So I'm going to cast the Spider instead. Which the opponent immediately tries to kill. Now, if I wanted to, I could protect the Spider by casting Tyvar's Stand to give it hexproof, meaning it cannot be the target of my opponent's spells, and indestructible, meaning that the damage from the spell won't kill it. But I would rather save those cards to protect my Blob once I do finally get it on the field. So now I draw my Planeswalker spell, Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, which I immediately cast. Now, Planeswalker abilities can be used once during each of your turns, but only during your main phase. So here I skip combat and proceed to my second main phase, where I can use one of Tyvar's abilities. Here I choose to use his -2 ability, taking his loyalty or life total from 3 down to 1. But that enables me to get my Dune Mover back out of the graveyard so that I can now find my 6th land. The opponent has found his 6th land as well, and is now finally able to cast his big payoff enchantment, Arcane Bombardment. An enchantment is a permanent that stays on the battlefield, and this specific one lets my opponent cast spells out of their graveyard anytime they cast a spell out of their hand, for free. Now this is an incredibly powerful card, and if I don't find a way to win the game soon, or take care of this enchantment, I might not be able to win the game at all. During my turn, I'll skip my initial main phase and proceed directly to combat. Now Dune Mover's Toxic ability will give my opponent 1 poison counter, as well as doing its 2 power damage to my opponent's life total. Now, if I can get my opponent up to 10 poison counters, I can win the game that way. But that's not the strategy for this deck. Using Tyvar's +1 ability during my second main phase, I am able to untap my Dune Mover so that I can then use him as a blocker, because only untapped creatures are able to block an opponent's attack. However, my opponent doesn't really have any creatures to attack with anyway, so whatever. So with the opponent tapped out again, and with enough mana to cast my Consuming Blob, as well as keeping mana up to protect it with Tyvar's Stand, now is the perfect time to cast my biggest threat. So I'll pass back to my opponent. As I do, the Blob's triggered ability happens on my end step, and I get a second copy of my Blob. Now with a land, artifact, creature, and sorcery in my graveyard, both creatures have a power of 4 and toughness of 5, which will make them very hard to deal with. My opponent casts a spell to draw 2 cards, which pulls a counter spell underneath Arcane Bombardment, which means that anytime he casts an instant, he can get a free counter spell to go against whatever it is I'm trying to do. He also attempts to bounce my token by returning it to my hand. I can actually protect it with Tyvar's Stand, but I would rather keep those spells to protect the original creature that makes the tokens instead, so I'm going to let the token go. And since tokens don't exist anywhere other than on the battlefield, it is unfortunately gone forever. My opponent continues to cast spells and tap out as he passes the turn back to me. I make my attacks, and pass the turn back, getting another blob on my end step. My opponent casts his second Arcane Bombardment. During my turn, I draw my second copy of Tyvar during my draw step, which is problematic, as Planeswalkers are legendary, meaning that I can only have one card with that specific name in play at a time. So if I were to cast my second Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, I would have to sacrifice my first one. Using his -2 ability first, though, I end up milling an enchantment, Audacity, as well as a third copy of Tyvar. In addition, the -2 ability lets me get my Cankerbloom back out of my graveyard and into play, which I can sacrifice to destroy the Arcane Bombardment. So with these new card types in my graveyard, both of my blobs are now 6 power creatures. As I proceed to my combat step to attack with both of them, that 12 damage would kill my opponent. He sees that I have enough power on board to deal with him, and concedes the game. Hopefully this video has taught you enough about Magic the Gathering and the different card types and how they interact with each other to understand the very basics of the game, and how to play a game yourself if you want to. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like the video and subscribe to my channel to get notifications on future installments of this series. You can also help support this channel by joining my Patreon with the link in the description below. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments section, where I will be more than happy to answer them either here or in a future video. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.